Tragedy of the commons. What is it? In this video, I want to tell you what situation you'd be in where that thing would even come up. I want to tell you what the tragedy of commons is and what it implies. Let's get started. The tragedy of the commons is sounding a lot like this one, the tragedy of the anti-commons. But these are very different theories, and they would come up around the same topics. They are both about the amount of consumption that people partake in, how much you take and use from something, from the natural resources. This one is about underconsumption, and this one is about overconsumption. We're talking about consumption. Since we're talking about overconsumption, that means that this topic, the tragedy of the commons, would come up in political conversations, maybe in political philosophical conversations. It could also come up in psychology if you're thinking about the rationality that somebody would have to overconsume the fish in a pond or the grass in a field, or to take too much of the shells on the beach. So it would come up in political philosophy or in politics, environmental ethics, sociology, or psychology, ecology, political science. So let's break down what the tragedy of the commons is and what it implies, knowing that this topic could come up in a number of different fields. In 1833, Lloyd published this idea about cows and pasture. So imagine there's this pasture, which is a large grassy field. And he's telling us to think about what it makes sense for each farmer to do. If I was farming cows and I saw this big public space with grass, I wouldn't want to pay money to feed my cows. I would bring my cows to this public land with grass so that my cows could eat for free. And if every farmer had access to that pasture, then every farmer would want to not pay for their cows to have to eat private grass on their own land, but they would bring their cows on this public space, and then the cows would eat all the grass, and then there would be no grass, and then the whole thing would be pointless. For each individual, it makes sense to bring their cow to the public pasture. Then they don't have to feed their cow. It gives short-term benefits. The harms are on the whole community, because then the pasture is no longer a pasture. It's no longer a grassy field. Let's have another example by another author. Garrett Hardin is an ecologist who writes about overpopulation. If each individual is allowed to have as many kids as they want, then each individual would have as many kids as they want. And if individuals like having children, then it turns out that the community is harmed because there will eventually be overpopulation. Now, the idea about overpopulation from each individual having freedom is very similar to, but different than, Lloyd's idea that if each individual has freedom, then there would be a depletion of natural resources. But both of them are getting at this idea of the tragedy of the commons. When you have something that the community is sharing, it makes rational sense for each individual to overuse it, to abuse it, to overconsume, because it doesn't harm the individual directly immediately. Individuals are rational for overusing public things or common things. And remember, rational doesn't mean is right, is ethical, is good. It just means it makes sense, it is logical. And then there's two things we could talk about when it comes to this. The individual benefits directly and immediately. On the other hand, the resources are eventually depleted, which is bad long-term, not short-term, and it's bad for everybody, for the community, not directly to the individual. And if you think about this, the resources are depleted for the community, and each individual is a member of the community. So that means that the individuals that are taking a seashell from the beach every time they go to the beach, eventually there will be no seashells on the beach for anybody to take, including that person, but that's long term and that's indirectly affecting the person. If an individual could benefit immediately and directly by taking a public good, then why would they restrain from doing so